Kethra had spent 40 years reading the stars through scanner displays, and she had never seen anything like this before in her entire career aboard. Valorian survey vessels. The Gentle Inquiry drifted at the edge of collective space where the Calorian survey vessels. The Gentle Inquiry drifted at the edge of collective space where the edge of collective space where those star maps showed nothing but empty void and dead systems that no species had bothered to claim in 10,000 years of galactic civilization. She pressed her four-fingered hands against the console and watched the numbers scroll across her screen. And none of them made any sense at all. Senior Technician called Commander Yethasol from his position at the center of the bridge. What is causing that alarm? The alarm had started 3 minutes ago, and it had not stopped since then, and Kethra did not have an answer that would satisfy anyone. I am still trying to determine the source, Commander, she said, and her voice remained steady, even though her hearts were beating much too fast inside her chest. Scanner system had detected something emerging from the dead zone, and the readings defied everything Kethra understood about physics and ship design and the fundamental nature of space travel. She ran the diagnostic sequence for the third time, and the results came back clean and the equipment was functioning perfectly, and that made everything so much worse. The scanners are not malfunctioning, she reported, and she heard the tremor in her own words. They are detecting something real, Commander. Yethasol rose from his seat and walked across the bridge to stand beside her station, and his presence should have been reassuring. But Kethra could see the confusion spreading across his face as he studied the display. Valorian Threat Assessment System was a marvel of engineering that had served the collective for over 2,000 years, and it could analyze any vessel and calculate its danger level on a scale from 1 to 100. A peaceful cargo ship registered as a 2 or 3, and a standard military cruiser came in around 40, and the most dangerous battleship ever recorded by the collective had scored a 67. Vessels emerging from the void were not registering numbers at all. The screen showed only 2 symbols that Kethra had never seen outside of theoretical error documentation, and those symbols were null and undefined. That is impossible, Yethasol whispered, and his usually calm voice cracked slightly. Run the assessment again. Kethra obeyed, and the system cycled through its calculations, and the same impossible result appeared on screen once more. Commander, I do not think you understand what this means, she said slowly. The threat assessment is not broken, and it is not confused, and it is not returning an error. She turned to look at him directly, and she watched his golden eyes widen as understanding began to dawn. The system cannot calculate a threat level because these vessels exceed every parameter we have ever programmed into it. She continued, it has no framework for what we are looking at. The bridge fell silent as every crew member stopped their work and turned to stare at the main view screen where the distant shapes of the unknown fleet hung against the backdrop of stars. There were 12 vessels in total, and they moved in perfect formation with a precision that spoke of either advanced automation or terrifying discipline, or perhaps both. Kethra switched her display to visual analysis as she felt her stomach drop as the images resolved into clarity. Valorian warships were elegant things, built for multiple purposes with weapon systems added almost as an afterthought because the collective believed in defense rather than aggression. These vessels were different, and the difference was so profound that it took Kethra several moments to process what she was seeing. The unknown ships were not vessels that carried weapons. They were weapons that happened to carry crew. Every line of their design spoke of destruction, and every angle served the purpose of delivering death more efficiently, and the hulls bristled with systems that Kethra could not identify but instinctively feared. What species builds ships like that? Someone whispered from across the bridge, and no one had an answer. Junior scanner technician Velen stepped up beside Kethra, and his young face had gone pale beneath his gray-green skin. I am detecting power signatures that make no sense, he said, and his hands trembled as he pointed at his own console. Those weapon systems are drawing more energy than our entire fleet uses in a standard year. Kethra nodded because she had seen the same readings, and she had hoped that she was misinterpreting them somehow. There is more. Velen continued, and his voice dropped to barely above a whisper. The structural analysis shows that those vessels could survive impacts that would vaporize anything we have ever built. Commander Yethasol straightened his posture and visibly forced himself to project calm, even though everyone on the bridge could see the fear in his eyes. Helm set course away from the unknown fleet. He ordered, "Communications, prepare an emergency transmission to Collective High Command." "Commander, wait." Kethra interrupted, and she pointed at her screen where new data was appearing. "They are not moving." The unknown fleet had stopped its advance, and the 12 vessels now held position in perfect stillness like predators, watching prey from a distance. Why would they stop? Yethazal asked, and no one could answer him. Kethra ran every analysis she could think of, and she cross-referenced the scanner data with every database the Gentle Inquiry carried, and nothing matched. And nothing even came close. "I am detecting active scanning from the unknown vessels," Velen reported. "They are analyzing us." The thought sent ice through Kethra's veins, because if those ships were studying the Gentle Inquiry, then they were learning about Valorian technology and Valorian weaknesses and Valorian everything. "Can you determine anything about their species?" Commander Yethasol asked. Kethra shook her head in frustration because the sensor data refused to provide clear answers. "The crew compartments are configured for bipedal beings of roughly Valorian size," she said. "Oxygen atmosphere and standard gravity requirements, and nothing else stands out. They could be any of 100 known species." Yethasol muttered, "No, Commander, they could not." Kethra replied, and she pulled up a galactic map on the main display. "No known species exists in that region of space, and no known species builds ships with these specifications, and no known species has ever caused our threat assessment to return null values." The unknown fleet continued to wait, and the silence stretched on, and Kethra found herself holding her breath without realizing it. "Perhaps they are peaceful," suggested the communications officer, though her voice carried no conviction. Kethra looked at the ships on her screen, and she looked at the impossible readings, and she looked at the weapons that seemed designed to end civilizations, and she could not make herself believe in peaceful intentions. Peaceful species do not build weapons capable of cracking planets, she said quietly. Commander Yethasol closed his eyes for a moment, and when he opened them again, his expression had hardened into determination. "We will maintain our position and observe," he decided. "We are a survey vessel, and surveying is what we do, and High Command needs information before they can act." The crew acknowledged his orders and returned to their stations, though no one could focus on anything except the unknown fleet hanging in space. Before them, hours passed, and the strangers made no move and transmitted no signal, and simply waited with patience that felt almost predatory in its stillness. Kethra stayed at her console through 3 shift changes, and she watched, and she analyzed, and she tried to understand what she was seeing. Near the end of the 4th hour, something changed. "Commander," she called out, and her voice carried across the suddenly silent bridge. "One of the vessels is moving forward, and it appears to be preparing some kind of transmission." Every eye turned to the main view screen as the lead ship of the unknown fleet broke formation and glided toward them with terrible grace. The transmission that followed was simple, and it came in over 100 different languages, including several Valorian dialects that the strangers should not have known existed. One word repeated in every tongue, and that single word changed everything. "Hello," said the unknown species, and the galaxy would never be the same again. The Axiom of Peace was the largest space station ever constructed by the Valorian Collective, and it hung in orbit above the homeworld. Like a silver crown of civilization, Fleet Admiral Sarn Thai stood at the head of the council chamber, and he stared at the holographic display with an expression that mixed confusion with growing dread. The transmission from the gentle inquiry had arrived 6 hours ago, and since then the entire leadership of the collective had gathered to study its contents. Play the scanner data again, ordered Elder Mothrai, from her seat at the curved table, and her ancient voice carried the weight of 3 centuries of wisdom. The hologram shifted and showed the 12 unknown vessels in perfect detail, and every council member watched in silence. As the threat assessment numbers flickered and died, Scientist Prime Kesseth rose from his chair and approached the display with the nervous energy of someone who had discovered something terrible and could not stop thinking about it. I have analyzed the sensor readings from 17 different angles using every mathematical model we possess, he said, and his thin fingers traced patterns in the air around the holographic ships. I need the council to understand what we are looking at. Admiral Soren Thigh nodded for him to continue, though his jaw was clenched tight. These vessels are not warships in the way that we understand warships, Kesseth explained, and he expanded the hologram to show internal structures. Our military cruisers are built as ships first and weapons platforms second, because we designed them to serve multiple roles. He gestured, and the display showed a standard Valorian battlecruiser beside one of the unknown vessels, and the comparison made several council members gasp audibly. These alien craft follow the opposite philosophy, Kesseth continued. They are weapons first and ships second, and every system aboard them exists to support one function, and that function is the complete and total destruction of anything they target. Elder Mothrai leaned forward, and her 4 eyes narrowed with concern. Surely you are exaggerating for effect, she said, though her voice lacked conviction. Sith shook his head and pulled up power signature readings that painted the air in alarming shades of red. The main weapon system on the largest vessel could penetrate our most advanced shields in a single shot, he said flatly. It could then continue through the hull and exit the other side, and still have enough energy remaining to destroy a second ship behind the first. The council chamber erupted in murmurs of disbelief and fear. Admiral Soren Thigh raised his hand for silence, and the room slowly quieted. What about their defensive capabilities, he asked, because a good commander always wanted the full picture before making decisions. Kesseth pulled up another data set, and his expression grew even more troubled. Their shields operate on principles we do not fully understand, he admitted. The energy readings suggest some kind of adaptive matrix that actually absorbs incoming fire and redistributes it through the ship's power grid. They turn our weapons into fuel, someone whispered from the back of the chamber. In essence, yes, Kesseth confirmed. And their hull armor appears to be layered with materials that our sensors cannot identify, but which demonstrate extraordinary resistance to heat and kinetic impact. Elder Mothrai closed her eyes and seemed to age another decade in a single moment. What manner of species builds such things, she asked, and her question echoed the one that had been spoken aboard the Gentle Inquiry hours earlier. A young physicist named Trellin stepped forward from the row of junior scientists who had been brought in to assist with the analysis. I may have a theory, he said, and his voice trembled slightly as every powerful figure in the collective turned to look at him. If the council will permit me to speak. Admiral Soren Thigh gestured for him to continue. Trellin walked to the holographic display, and he stared at the alien ships for a long moment before he found the words. We have always assumed that spacefaring civilizations develop along similar paths, he began. Peaceful advancement followed by exploration, followed by occasional defensive conflicts when territory or resources overlap. He turned to face the council, and his young eyes held a terrible understanding. But what if a species did not follow that path? He continued. What if a species spent thousands of years fighting itself before it ever reached the stars? The chamber fell absolutely silent. Consider the implications, Trellin said, and his voice grew stronger as he warmed to his theory. A species that learned to wage war across an entire planet would develop weapons and tactics that we cannot imagine because we have never needed to imagine them. He pointed at the holographic ships and his hand shook slightly. These beings did not stumble into warfare like we did as a last resort against the Harak Raiders 300 years ago. He said, they perfected it and they mastered it, and they refined it over countless generations. Elder Mothri spoke into the heavy silence that followed. You are saying that these aliens are natural warriors. I am saying they are something far more dangerous than that. Trellin replied. I am saying they are professionals. Admiral Sarenthai began pacing the length of the council chamber, and his military mind worked through scenarios and possibilities. If they are as dangerous as you suggest, then why did they stop? He asked. Why send a greeting instead of simply destroying the gentle inquiry? Scientist Prime Kesseth had been studying additional data while Trellin spoke, and now he looked up with an expression of confusion. Admiral, I may have found something relevant, he said. The transmission they sent was not just in multiple languages, but in multiple communication formats. Explain. Sarenthai commanded. They broadcast their greeting in radio waves and subspace frequencies and laser, pulse codes and gravitational wave modulation. Kesseth listed. They used every communication method known to the collective and several that we have only theorized about. He paused, and his confusion deepened. Admiral, they wanted to make absolutely certain that we understood them, he said. They took extraordinary care to ensure their message of greeting would not be misinterpreted. That does not match the profile of a purely aggressive species. Elder Mothri observed. Before anyone could respond, the chamber doors opened and a communications officer rushed in with a datapad clutched in her hands. Forgive the interruption, she said breathlessly, but we have received a new transmission from the unknown fleet. Admiral Sarenthai took the datapad and read its contents, and his expression shifted through surprise and uncertainty, and something that might have been hope. They are requesting formal diplomatic contact, he announced. They call themselves humans, and they say they come from a world called Earth, and they wish to establish peaceful relations with the collective. The council erupted into debate, with voices overlapping as everyone tried to speak. At once, Elder Mothri stood and raised her arms, and her ancient authority silenced the chamber. We have two possibilities before us, she said calmly. Either these humans are deceiving us about their peaceful intentions, or they genuinely seek friendship, despite building the most terrifying warships we have ever seen. She looked around the table at her fellow leaders. Either way, we must meet them, and we must learn more. She continued, because a species capable of constructing such vessels of destruction, yet choosing to say hello instead of opening fire, is perhaps the most fascinating and terrifying thing we could possibly encounter. Admiral Sarenthai nodded slowly. I will assemble a diplomatic delegation, he said, and I will ensure that our own fleet stands ready in case this turns out to be a trap. He looked at the holographic display one final time, and those impossible ships still hung there waiting, though I suspect that if they wanted to destroy us, our entire fleet would not be enough to stop them. He admitted quietly. The council chamber emptied slowly as everyone went to prepare for what might be the most important diplomatic mission in collective history. Only Trellin remained behind, staring at the images of the human warships and wondering what kind of species could create such instruments of devastation and still choose peace. He did not know the answer yet, but he suspected that learning it would change everything the collective believed about the nature of civilization itself. The diplomatic vessel Open Hand waited in neutral space, exactly halfway between the collective border and the position of the human fleet elder. Mothra stood at the observation window and watched the stars and tried to calm the anxiety that coiled in her stomach like a living thing. She had negotiated with 17 different species across her long career, and she had never felt fear like this before any meeting. The security detail behind her consisted of 12 of the finest warriors the Paulist Collective had ever produced, and each of them wore full combat armor and carried weapons that could punch through starship hulls. None of them looked confident. "Elder, the human shuttle is approaching," announced the communications officer. Mathrai turned from the window and straightened her ceremonial robes and composed her expression into the neutral mask of a diplomat. "Open the docking bay and escort our guests to the meeting chamber," she ordered. The minutes that followed felt like hours as Mathrai waited and listened to the reports coming through her earpiece. The human shuttle had docked without incident, and the humans were disembarking, and they were walking through the corridors toward her position. Then the security captain's voice crackled through with an edge of panic. Barely contained. "Elder, we have a situation," he said. "My warriors are experiencing involuntary fear responses, and some of them are struggling to maintain composure." Mathrai frowned in confusion. "Explain," she demanded. "The humans," the captain replied, and his voice dropped to a whisper. "There is something wrong about them, and every instinct I have is screaming that we are in the presence of predators." Before Mathrai could respond, the chamber doors opened, and the human delegation entered. There were only 3 of them, and they wore simple clothing without armor, and they carried no visible weapons, and yet Mathrai felt it immediately. The security captain had been right. Her body recognized danger on a level that her mind could not explain, and every cell screamed at her to run, to hide, to escape before it was too late. The lead human stepped forward, and Mathrai forced herself to stand her ground. This creature was small compared to a Valorian warrior, standing perhaps 5.5 feet tall with soft-looking skin and no visible claws or natural weapons. And yet, Mathrai's heart pounded and her hands trembled, and she understood in that moment what prey felt like. The human smiled, and Mathrai saw teeth, and those teeth belonged to an omnivore, and the shape of them spoke of a species that had spent millions of years hunting and killing and eating meat. "Elder Mathrai," the human said in perfect Valorian, and her voice was warm and friendly. "I am Ambassador Celia Vance of the United Earth Coalition, and I am honored to meet you." Mathrai found her voice, though it took more effort than she wanted to admit. "Ambassador Vance," she replied, and she was proud that her words came out steady. "The collective welcomes you, and we are pleased to begin this dialogue." They moved to the meeting table and sat across from each other, and the other humans took positions behind their ambassador, while Mathrai's guards did the same. The fear did not fade, and Mathrai noticed that her warriors had positioned themselves with hands near their weapons without even realizing they had done so. Ambassador Vance seemed to notice this too, and her expression shifted to something that looked almost like sadness. "I apologize for the discomfort our presence causes you," she said gently. "We have encountered this reaction before with other species, and we understand that it is not intentional." Mathrai tilted her head in surprise at this acknowledgement. "You know that you frighten us," she said. "Yes," Vance confirmed. "Our scientists believe it is an evolutionary response, and that your instincts recognize us as apex predators, even though we mean you no harm." She spread her hands in a gesture of openness. "Humans evolved on a world where we were not the fastest or the strongest species," she explained. "We survived by using our minds and our tools and our ability to work together in groups. And yet, you became predators," Mathrai observed. "We became the dominant species on our planet," Vance agreed. "We hunted everything that could be hunted, and we outlasted everything that could not be hunted. And eventually, there was nothing left that could threaten us, except ourselves." This caught Mathrai's attention because it connected to the theories she had heard from young Trellin. "Your species fought amongst itself," she said. Ambassador Vance's expression grew serious, and something ancient and heavy passed behind her eyes. "For thousands of years," she confirmed, "we divided ourselves by nation and by religion and by ideology, and we made war upon each other with weapons that grew more terrible with each generation. She paused and seemed to gather herself before continuing. We developed weapons that could poison the land for centuries, she said quietly. We created bombs that could destroy entire cities in a single flash of light, and we built systems that could launch those bombs at each other within minutes. Mothrai felt the color drain from her face as she listened. We came within moments of extinction more than once, Vance continued. And still we kept building and kept fighting and kept perfecting the art of killing. Why? Mothrai asked, and her voice came out as barely a whisper. Ambassador Vance looked at her directly, and those soft human eyes held depths that Mothrai had not expected, because we could not trust each other to stop. She said, because every time one group developed a new weapon, another group had to develop a counter or risk annihilation. She leaned back in her chair, and her guards shifted slightly behind her. We learned a terrible lesson across those centuries of bloodshed, she said. We learned that the only way to ensure peace was to make war so devastating that no one would dare to start one. Mothrai thought about the ships that had caused the gentle inquiry scanners to shriek with undefined terror. Your warships, she said slowly as understanding began to dawn. Our warships are not a threat, Ambassador Vance replied, and her voice carried the weight of absolute conviction. They are a promise. She met Mothrai's eyes and held them. The promise is this, she continued. If anyone threatens our people or our allies or our friends, then we will end them, and we will do it completely and without mercy and without hesitation. The chamber fell silent, and even the air seemed to hold still. We spent millennia learning how to destroy each other, Vance said quietly, and now we carry that knowledge with us wherever we go, not because we want to use it, but because we pray we never have to. Mothrai found herself believing this human, and she did not fully understand why. You choose peace, she said. Every single day, Vance confirmed. We wake up and we choose not to unleash the horrors we have created, and we hope that today will be another day where that choice remains easy. She smiled again, and this time Mothrai saw the warmth behind the predator's teeth. We came to your space looking for trade and friendship and mutual understanding, Vance said. We have no desire for conquest or domination, and we have learned through bitter experience that such things bring only suffering. And yet you keep your weapons ready? Mothrai observed. Always, Vance agreed without hesitation. Because the galaxy is vast, and we do not know what threats exist beyond the next star. She reached across the table and offered her hand in what Mothrai recognized as a human gesture of friendship. We offer you our hand in peace, Elder Mothrai, she said. And behind that hand stands the full might of human innovation and human determination and human fury, should anyone ever threaten those we call friends. Mothrai looked at that small soft hand, and she thought about everything she had learned today. She thought about ships that made scanners scream, and weapons that could crack worlds, and a species that had nearly destroyed itself before reaching the stars, and she thought about a people who had learned from that destruction, and who now offered peace with one hand while holding thunder in the other. Slowly, and with great deliberation, she reached out and took Ambassador Vance's hand. The collective accepts your friendship, she said, and we will work to build trust between our peoples. Vance's smile widened, and for just a moment, Mothrai could see past the predator and glimpse the person beneath. That is all we ask, the human said. A chance to prove that we are more than our weapons. They released hands, and the negotiations began in earnest, and Mothrai found herself hoping that this strange, terrifying, wonderful species would become the allies they promised to be, because she suspected that having humans as enemies would be the last mistake the collective ever made. 6 months had passed since first contact and the agricultural world of Velaris. 7 had never been more peaceful. 12 million Valorians worked the fertile fields that covered the planet's surface, and they sent their harvests across collective space to feed hundreds of colony worlds. Children played in the streets of quiet towns, and elders watched the sunset from comfortable porches, and no one thought about war or violence or the darkness between stars. Human patrol group called Shepherds. Watch had arrived 3 days ago on what the diplomatic corps called a goodwill. 2 or 4 vessels had taken up orbit around Valorous 7, and their crews had been granted shore leave, and the locals had been nervous at first about hosting the strange predator species, but the humans had proven to be friendly and curious and surprisingly gentle, and many Valorians had begun to relax around their new allies. Captain Marcus Cole of the United Earth Coalition vessel Prometheus stood on the bridge of his ship and watched the blue-green world turn slowly beneath him. He was a tall man with gray at his temples and scars on his hands from decades of service, and he had seen enough combat to last several lifetimes. This assignment was supposed to be easy and peaceful, and a chance for his crew to rest after a difficult year of border patrols. Tactical officer's voice shattered that peaceful illusion. "Captain, we have multiple contacts emerging from subspace." Lieutenant Chen reported, and her voice carried the sharp edge of alarm, designating as hostile based on energy signatures. Cole straightened in his command chair and felt the familiar cold focus of combat readiness settle over him. "How many contacts?" he asked. Chen's face went pale as she studied her displays. "Counting 600 and climbing, Captain," she said. "Configuration matches Harak raider vessels." The bridge crew exchanged looks of horror because everyone knew what the Harak were and what they did to the worlds they attacked. The Harak were a locust species that swept across civilizations and stripped them bare, and they took slaves and resources and left nothing but ash and bones behind. Time until they reached weapons range of Valorous 7. Cole demanded 47 minutes at their current approach speed. Chun replied. Cole's mind raced through the tactical situation, and none of the options were good. Nearest collective fleet was 3 days away at maximum speed, and his patrol group consisted of 4 ships against an armada of over 600. Open a channel to the other ships, he ordered. The faces of his fellow captains appeared on screen, and all of them showed the same grim understanding. Captain Sarah Webb of the Defiant spoke first. "We cannot fight those numbers, Marcus," she said. "Standard protocol would be to withdraw and report." Captain James Okonkwo of the Vigilant nodded in agreement. "If we stay, we die, and that helps no one," he added. Cole looked at the planet turning beneath them, and he thought about 12 million people going about their lives without any idea of what was coming. He thought about children playing in streets and elders watching sunsets and farmers tending crops that would never be harvested. "Protocol says we withdraw," he agreed slowly. But protocol was not written for this situation. Captain Diana Torres of the Relentless leaned forward on her screen. "What are you thinking, Marcus?" she asked. Cole stood from his chair and walked to the viewport and stared at Valorous 7. 6 months ago, Ambassador Vance told the collective that our ships were a promise, he said quietly. "A promise that if anyone threatened our friends, we would end them." He turned back to face his fellow captains. "These people trusted us enough to let us orbit their world," he continued. "They opened their homes to our crews and shared their food and their stories, and their children asked our sailors to tell them about Earth." His voice hardened with resolve. "If we run now, then our promise means nothing," he said, "and humanity's word becomes worthless across the entire galaxy." The other captains were silent for a long moment. Then Sarah Webb smiled, and it was not a friendly expression. "Well, Captain Cole," she said, "I did not join the coalition Navy to abandon civilians to the Harak." Okonkwo nodded slowly. 4 ships against 600, he said. "The odds are terrible." His smile matched Webb's. "I have always wanted to see if the recruitment posters were telling the truth about human warfare." The added. Torres simply cracked her knuckles and began issuing orders to her crew. Cole returned to his command chair and opened a channel to the approaching Harak fleet. "Attention, Harak vessels," he said, and his voice carried across the void. "This world is under the protection of the United Earth Coalition and you will alter course immediately or face the consequences. The response came quickly, and the Harak commander's insectoid face filled the screen with mandibles clicking in what might have been laughter. 4 small ships threatened the swarm. The Harak said, "Your species is unknown to us, but you will learn fear soon enough. You misunderstand." Cole replied calmly, "I am not threatening you, and I am giving you one chance to survive." More clicking laughter came through the speakers. The swarm does not retreat. The Harak commander declared, "We will consume your vessels and enslave your crews, and then we will feast upon the world you foolishly tried to protect." Cole nodded as if he had expected nothing else. "Then I want you to remember this moment," he said. "Remember that you were given a choice, and remember that you chose wrong." He cut the transmission and looked at his bridge crew, and every face showed determination without doubt. "All hands battle stations," he announced. "Charge all weapons and raise shields to maximum and prepare for combat acceleration." The Prometheus came alive around him as systems powered up and crew members rushed to their positions, and the ship transformed from a diplomatic visitor into an instrument of war similar. Reports came in from the Defiant and the Vigilant and the Relentless as 4 human warships prepared to face impossible odds. Cole opened a channel to the planetary government below. "Administrator Vethran, this is Captain Cole of the UEC Prometheus," he said. "I regret to inform you that a Harak raiding fleet is approaching your world." The Valorian administrator's face appeared on screen, and terror filled his eyes. "Captain, we have no defenses," he said. "Our fleet is days away, and we cannot evacuate 12 million people in time." "You will not need to evacuate," Cole replied. "We are going to stop them." Vethran stared at him in disbelief. "You have 4 ships," he said. "The Harak number in the hundreds." Cole smiled, and it was the smile of a wolf baring its teeth. "Administrator, I want you to understand something about humanity," he said. "We spent 10,000 years fighting each other, and we got very good at it." He stood and straightened his uniform. "Today you will see what human ships were designed to do," he continued, "and I suggest you tell your people to watch the sky because they will want to remember this." He cut the channel and turned to his crew. "Navigation plot and intercept course," he ordered. "We meet them head-on before they get anywhere near weapons range of the planet." Lieutenant Chen looked up from her console. "Captain, at maximum combat acceleration, we will reach engagement range in 12 minutes, she reported. Cole nodded and gripped the arms of his chair. Then, in 12 minutes, the Harak learned why the collective scanners could not calculate a threat level for human warships. He said, the 4 ships of Shepard's Watch burned toward the approaching swarm, and behind them, a peaceful world waited. 12 million people looked up at the sky and wondered if they would live to see another sunrise, and 4 human captains prepared to show the galaxy exactly what humanity was capable of. The battle lasted 11 minutes. Elder Mothrai watched the sensor recordings aboard the collective flagship Eternal Resolve, and she could not speak and she could not look away. The fleet had arrived 3 days too late to help, and now they could only study what had happened and try to understand. The recordings began with 4 human ships accelerating towards 600 Harak vessels, and the mathematics of that engagement should have been simple. 4 against 600 meant the humans would die quickly, and the Harak would barely slow down. The mathematics lied. First volley from the human ships crossed the void like lightning made solid, and each shot found its target with precision that seemed almost supernatural. Harak vessels exploded in chains of fire as railgun rounds traveling at fractions of light speed punched through shields and armor and reactors. The buzz swarm formation scattered and regrouped and returned fire with everything they had, and the space between the fleets filled with energy beams and missiles and death, and the human ships danced. Mothray had never seen anything move like that, and she doubted she ever would again. Prometheus rolled and twisted through incoming fire with movements that should have torn the vessel apart, and her weapons never stopped firing. The Defiant split away and drew dozens of HFY ships after her before turning and destroying them all in a single devastating broadside. The Vigilant held position like an immovable fortress, and her point defense systems created a wall of destruction that nothing could penetrate. The Relentless lived up to her name and pushed deeper into the swarm than any sane commander would have dared. Through it all, the humans spoke to each other on open channels, and Mothray listened to their voices with growing wonder. They did not sound afraid. They did not sound angry. They sounded like professionals doing a job they had trained their entire lives to perform. Defiant, break left and engage. The flanking group. Captain Cole commanded. Vigilant, give us covering fire on approach vector 7. Captain Webb replied. Relentless, you are taking too much damage. Pull back to formation. Captain Okonkwo warned. Negative, Vigilant, I have them right where I want them. Captain Torres responded. The HFY fought back with desperate fury, and they outnumbered the humans by more than 100 to 1, and surely weight of numbers would eventually tell, but the humans would not stop. A Herrick beam carved through the Prometheus's port shields, and hull and atmosphere vented into space, and damage alarms screamed across every frequency. Captain Cole's voice came through calm and steady. Seal deck 7 and redistribute power to weapons. He ordered. Torres, cover our approach. The Relentless swept between the Prometheus and the attacking Herrick, and her guns blazed, and a dozen enemy vessels died. Defiant took a direct hit to her engine section, and her acceleration dropped by half, and still she kept fighting. The Vigilant's shields failed entirely, and her hull glowed cherry red from absorbed energy, and her crew kept firing minute by minute. The HFY numbers dropped. 100 destroyed, then 200, then 300. And still the humans did not retreat. The swarm had never encountered anything like this, and their formation began to break apart as individual ships decided that survival mattered more than victory. Captain Cole opened a channel to the fleeing vessels. This is your final chance, he said. Surrender now, and we will spare your lives. Some of the HFY listened and dropped out of formation and powered down their weapons. The others tried to run. They did not get far. The human ships pursued, and the killing continued until nothing remained but debris fields and escape pods and silence. When it was over, the 4 vessels of Shepard's Watch limped back toward Valoris 7, and smoke poured from their wombs, and their crews tended to their dead. 47 human sailors had given their lives to protect a world that was not their own. 612 HFY ships had been destroyed in 11 minutes. Elder Mothray stood on her bridge and watched the recordings end, and she found that tears were streaming down her face. How? She whispered. How did they do that? Her tactical officer shook his head in stunned disbelief. Our scanners recorded the entire engagement, and I still cannot explain it, he admitted. Their weapons are devastating, yes, but their real advantage is something else. What? Mothray asked. They never hesitated, the officer replied. Every maneuver was perfect, and every shot was calculated, and they moved like a single organism with 4 bodies. He looked at Mothray with something like awe in his eyes. We train for war as a necessity, he said. They train for it as an art form. The collective fleet took up orbit around Valoris 7, and Mothray transported down to the surface to meet with the human survivors. She found Captain Cole standing in a field outside the capital city, and he was watching the sunset with tired eyes, had bandages on his arms and burns on his face, and he moved like every step caused him pain. Captain Cole, she said softly as she approached. He turned and managed a weak smile. Elder Mothray, he replied. I apologize for the mess we made of local space. Mothray stared at him and tried to find words and failed. You saved 12 million lives, she finally said. 4 ships against 600, and you saved them all. Cole's smile faded, and something heavy settled behind his eyes. We lost 47 good people, he said, and I will carry their names with me forever. He turned back to watch the sunset, and the colors painted his wounded face in shades of gold and red. We did not want this fight. He continued quietly. We came here hoping for peaceful trade and cultural exchange, and instead we had to become what we hate most. Mothrai moved to stand beside him. You became protectors, she said. We became killers, Cole replied. Good at it, yes, but killers nonetheless. They stood in silence for a long moment and watched the sun sink toward the horizon. Ambassador Vance told me about your promise, Mothrai said. About what human ships represent. Cole nodded slowly. A promise we hoped we would never have to keep, he said. You kept it today, Mothrai replied. For people who are not your species on a world that is not your own, Cole looked at her, and his eyes held depths of pain and determination, and something that might have been hope. When Vance offered you our friendship, she meant it, he said. And friendship means something to humans. He gestured at the peaceful fields around them and the distant lights of the city beginning to glow in the gathering dusk. Those people trusted us to protect them, he said. And they were right. To trust. Mothrai felt something shift in her understanding of humanity and the universe and everything she thought she knew about the nature of power. What will you do now? She asked. Cole smiled again, and this time it reached his eyes. We will repair our ships and honor our dead and continue our mission, he said, because the galaxy is vast and there will always be those who threaten the innocent. He turned to face her fully, and humanity will be there to stop them. He continued, because that is who we choose to be. Later that night, Mothrai composed a message that would be broadcast across every collective world and to every species with ears to hear. Today the humans showed us who they truly are, she wrote. They are not the monsters their weapons suggest, and they are not the peaceful traitors they claim to be. They are something far more important. They are guardians. Their ships scream of destruction because they were built to end any threat completely and without mercy, but the hands on those weapons belong to people who weep for their fallen comrades, and who watch sunsets, and who chose to die rather than abandon those they call friends. The humans are not to be feared. They are to be treasured. For, in the darkness between stars, they have chosen to be shepherds. And God help anything that threatens the flock. The message spread across the galaxy, and species that had never heard of humanity learned their name, and everywhere the message went. Civilizations began to understand that something had changed. A new power had risen among the stars, and they carried weapons that made scanners shriek with terror. But they also carried something else. They carried a promise, and they intended to keep it.